Hi guys, and welcome back to day 23. So today I wanted to try to figure out a little bit of a way to show that there's an environment this character exists in a world and not just in an independent floating void where he's just in a picture. And I wanted to be able to do it without necessarily doing a very full, complete background. I wanted it to be something that hinted at a background. And I actually really love designing these where it almost fools the eye in some ways when you have just the tiniest bit of a hint of an object or a thing that places that character and really grounds it out. Immediately your brain begins forming associations and filling in the gaps. When you see things like that, our brains are meant to be able to see connections and see symbols. So when you can add even just these very small details that look like they could be something, or details that are part of an environment but not necessarily the full environment, it really does enhance the piece itself. And I think that there's a lot of times that I could use this as an option, but I don't really. So I'd like to get more into the habit of thinking through how can I ground out my characters without necessarily needing to do a full environment. I can take a lot of the designs that I do figure out that are portraits and adding these elements that I think will just really enhance it overall. But today I decided to try implementing this curtain that's right above his head. It was something that I wanted to play with where it was behind him as well as overlapping in front of him. And I've talked about this in the past, but overlapping shapes instantly give pieces depth. It pushes things back, it pulls things forward, and it is a very useful tool when you want to give something actual form and space within your picture plane. So that was something that I wanted to do with these curtains, is instead of just doing them behind him, which really could have flattened it out, I wanted to do it so that it was receding into the background behind him and it's broken up into pieces. So part of it's flipping up and overlapping his face. And this also solves a little bit of a thing where it can give me a chance to do a very strong cast shadow on his face and the rest of him, and that also gives it a lot of depth. And cast shadow is also something that I don't put in my pieces nearly enough because it really does enhance things. I love the look of pieces that have these cast shadows from other objects. It gives so much realism to a piece and interest that there wouldn't have been if it wasn't there. So I'm trying to be more aware of objects that would be casting shadows, especially if I realign where the light source is. I do try to design specifically where that's coming from so that I can get the most out of the shapes that are in the piece. So for this one, I had the light coming from kind of the upper left-hand corner where it's hitting that curtain that's flipping over, and it blocks the light. The curtain blocks the light, and then it shines on part of him, and part of him is in shadow. I think that shadows are definitely one of my weak points when it comes to painting, whether it's with ink wash like I am today or when I'm using watercolors, which is my normal medium. I don't think I push them nearly enough, and I don't design them out as strongly as I like for most of my pieces. So this was a good exercise for me. I definitely did not execute the shadow on this one well or as good as I wish that I had, but I certainly learned that there are things that I would like to be better at. I think the big thing is that I wasn't as confident when I was putting in this cast shadow that was coming down from that curtain. And because of that, it ended up that I was being a little bit more timid with the shape that it was casting on his face, where I didn't quite want to commit yet, and he didn't quite want to commit to covering as much of his face. So it ends up being a little bit more of a textured shadow than I would have liked, where if I had known what I was getting myself into, if I had been more committed to having a large shadow and having the shape already planned out, I would have been able to make it a little bit more consistent, and it would have looked a lot more like one consistent cast shadow rather than like there's a little bit of a texture thing going on underneath it. But yeah, I think probably the biggest thing I learned from dealing with that kind of a shadow is definitely commitment and planning. It goes with anything else in the piece. The shadow is a strong design point, and it's a shape that I want to make sure that I get right. So I think being a little bit more prepared and planned and committed to that from the very beginning would have really helped that become a little bit more nailed down. And the pattern on the curtains, I think, was also a lesson in planning and being a little bit more aware of how he's going to execute it. So I show briefly in the sketch. I had them all drawn out in the sketch, my basic figuring of how it was going to lay out. And I was thinking, okay, well, I don't really want to ink them. I want them to be in the ink wash so that they have a different look to them and a different texture. And I really love patterns that are in the painting rather than just in the line work. But I should have penciled it in, I think. I should have outlined them still, because when it came time to actually painting them, I was not consistent with the shape, where if I was transferring it over with a pencil and really planning it out, I could have made sure that things were lined up correctly, and I was a lot more figured out and planned with what it was actually going to be executed with. And I ended up going with almost like a brush stroke look, where I let it just kind of happen as I was doing it, but that ended up looking very inconsistent. But I did find a little bit of a solution, so I ended up going in with, it's actually a liner brush. And small side note, these are brushes where it's a very thin brush, but the bristles are very, very long. And I always thought that sounded so unwieldy and unusable, but it was extremely helpful for this, where it held a lot of paint. So I didn't have to keep going in and dipping in for more paint, because normally when you're using a very thin brush, it dries out really quickly. It uses up the paint that it has, but this one lasted so long. So it was a lifesaver for the effect that I did. But anyways, I'll definitely be using that brush a lot more now that I'm seeing the benefits of it. But I took that brush and I just went in, and over top of that basic layout of the pattern, I created a bunch of really little strokes that built up. So that way I could correct some of the shape issues. The ones that were bigger, I could keep it inside of that initial shape, and the ones that I accidentally made smaller, I could build up with those strokes. And because it was uneven and textured on top of that, it didn't need to be precise to look a lot more correct and better. Overall, I mean, I definitely could have executed it better, and I wish that I had, but I'm glad that I was able to find at least a way to make it look a little bit less haphazard. So I'll count that as a success and learn what I did learn from it. And another thing that really helped this piece is there was a point where I had pretty much everything painted in, but it was just looking really homogeneous. I wasn't really sure how to make it read better, because there were a lot of elements that suddenly became very similar values, and I was struggling to make it really readable. And ultimately, I was looking at the background that's supposed to be receding behind him, this open space that's underneath the curtain, and it was just too light. Ultimately, I came to that decision. I was concerned about making it darker because I didn't want his hair to get lost, but then I realized most of his hair is overlapping the curtains, which means that when I painted in the background a darker value, it immediately helped. It helped the jacket pop forward because it was no longer the same value as the background, and because there was almost no overlap with the hair, it was not a lot of area or detail that was getting lost. It was just a few little bit of his hair at the bottom, which is totally fine for that kind of a detail to be blending in with a background element like that. So that was a good reminder that sometimes I'm a little too timid with the values, especially when something needs to be pushed back or needs to be darker. Like this, it was supposed to be an empty space, but because it was so light and it was pretty much the same value as some of the foreground elements, it was immediately flattening the piece out, and that was just one tick down in the darkness scale that really just made it immediately have a lot more depth to this piece. So yeah, I could definitely learn a lesson from that I need to push some of the values a lot more and figure out how I can make sure that each value is significantly different from the others, at least when it comes to things that really do need to pop and not be grouped together. Looking back at it now that I'm editing it and it's already done, I wish that I had added a little bit more of a gradient of a darker value at the top of the curtains and then brought it down so that it lightened up as it was flipping up a little bit and coming into the light source. I think that just would have helped bring the focus back down to the figure and the character's face specifically, rather than having a lot of very light value all the way up to the left upper corner. So I think that could have really helped the overall look of this piece. I did try it at one point, but again, I think I was a little bit timid with it, and I ended up getting worried that it was too dark. And also my execution of painting that graded wash was not very smooth or consistent. So ultimately that was something that yes, I think I could have done a lot better with. And that's it for today. As always, I do have the original of this one available at my art shop, and I have lots of other prints that actually have colors. So if you're new here, I have a lot of great art goodies over at my art shop that you can check out. There's a link in the description as well as in the end card. And I post daily Inktober videos, so I will be back tomorrow with another one. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you tomorrow.